Eretz. And we're going to have 3 terutzim today. We're going to go through all 3 terutzim and analyze them and rip them apart. And then we're going to discuss why each one of these 3 mitarutzim didn't hold of the other terutzim. And then we're going to have a third shita who doesn't hold of anybody. In Kachim, you always have to run into a risker. So that's what we're going to do today. So we were middle of Rabbah, and Rabbah said that where did Reb Shimon say that you don't have a shaloi l'shema by a mincha? That's a shinu kodesh, because that's obvious. But a shinu bailim, which is not necessarily so obvious, that's where Reb Shimon said you do have the psul of shaloi l'shema. And the Gemara was challenging Rabbah with examples of other karbanos that also it would be obvious. So that took us to somewhere in the middle of Gimel Amud Aleph, and that was where the Gemara challenged from Kache Kachim and Kachim Kalim. So a case where you shechted Kadeshim Kalim, you shechted Kadeshim Kachim, L'Shem Kadeshim Kalim, you shechted Kadeshim Kalim, L'Shem Kachim Kachim, B'darim. So that was the case. So let's have a look at the Gemara inside. Kadeshim Kalim, Sheshachtan B'darim, L'Shem Kachim Kachim. So it's obvious that this is not Kachim Kachim because you're shechting it B'darim, Lirtzu, because Ma'aseh Ma'chichen Alayim, the Kachim Kalim. It's clear from the fact that the shechita here is occurring B'darim that this is Kachim Kalim, and not like you're clearly lying kavana of Kachim Kachim. The Kachim Kachim b'tzafin hava avad lehu. That was the kasha that the Gemara had on Rabbah's approach. So we actually did learn this yesterday, but I'm moving back here because I want to get into the flow. So Amri, what did they answer? Kadeshe Kachim ninu uma'aver hu the aver v'shachat l'b'darim. Just because it shechted in the darim doesn't mean an obvious signal that this is Kachim Kalim. It doesn't. Maybe it's still Kachim Kachim, but he's shechting it in the wrong place, which now opened up a whole new arena, because it's possible that it's obviously not being treated as Kachim Kachim, yet we'll still say that its kavana of shaloi l'shema will be valid. So, Frank the Gemara, once you have that, you've neutralized Rabbah's whole teretz, because ihachi machvas l'shem marcheshes nami. Your whole kasha was, or your comment, Rabbah, was that if it's a minchas machvas and he has kavana l'shem marcheshes, we know he's lying. No, maybe he could believe that this is a marcheshes. Haidika comments lo marcheshes. Amar, the kohen who's doing this kmitza, is saying, "Hi b'marcheshes nadar." Really, the bailim of this carbon was neither to bring a minchas marcheshes, and he did something wrong. Even though he brought it in a machvas, he wasn't supposed to. The marcheshes who aver who the avar, but also b'machvas. So why don't you say the same thing? If he's processing a minchas machvas and he has the kavanah of a marcheshes, don't discount his kavanah and say it doesn't count. It very much counts, because maybe in fact this is a minchas marcheshes, but the bailim brought it in the wrong form. Zok to Gemara, there you cannot say it. By a mincha you cannot say that. Why not? Because what identifies what type of mincha this is not the kavanah of the bailim, is not the intent of the bailim. It's what he actually did, or in other words, his actions speak louder than his words. So hatam ki nami b'marcheshes nadar. Even though the original neder to be mechayiv this yid with a mincha was for a minchas marcheshes, but kimaisi la b'machvas, if he physically brought it in a machvas, then he's not bringing his neder. Then it's just like a new carbon that he's bringing. Kimaisi la b'machvas, machvasi. It's a minchas machvas. So you still have that same svara that if the kohen doing the kmitza on a minchas machvas has kavanah l'shem marcheshes, that's an invalid kavanah. It's obviously invalid and patently false on its face. Kiditnan, like we learned, or the opposite of b'machvas, it's a perfectly good carbon. It's just not the carbon that he had obliged himself to bring. So his carbon is good, but he'll still have to fulfill his nether. Masha heavy, but videi nidrei lo yatsa. So therefore, you cannot say that there's any legitimate reason why the kohen could consider this mincha, which presents itself as a machvas, he cannot think that this could be a marcheshes. But there's another way we could look at, there's another option that could have happened where it would justify this kohen's false thought that it's a marcheshes. And what is that? The dilma the omar zu. In other words, the Bailam had his flour prepared for his mincha the keli, and he said, "Harezu machvas," or "Harezu marcheshes." So now it's not a question of whether or not he's bringing a marcheshes or a machvas. When the Bailam was makdish it, he was makdish not on himself an abstract chiyuv to bring it, and now you could decide if what he's bringing is fulfilling that chiyuv. He was talking specifically about this flour, and he identified this as a machvas. V'dilma the Omar Zu Kiditnan, and the Shita Rashi takes out the next couple of words. Kiditnan, like we learned, Zu Lahavi b'machvas. If he said, "I'm going to bring this flour as a minchas machvas," the heavy b'marcheshes, and he brought it as a marcheshes, now already there's a much stronger argument because now this is taka a machvas, and he's bringing it as a marcheshes, or vice versa. He said, I'm going to bring this flour as a marcheshes. The heavy b'machvas harezu psula. It will be possible. Why? Because in fact it does retain its identity. So then now we could make our argument. Maybe it's being in just such a case, you had a mincha that presented itself as a machvas, but we know that the Bailam might have said originally harezu marcheshes. So maybe the kohen is thinking to himself, maybe the Bailam said on this harezu marcheshes. So yes, it's a weird taina, but the kohen's thought that this is a marcheshes, even though it's sitting here in front of him in a machvas, might be something of a valid taina, and it should pass it. So imagine. So let's look at the full scenario. A minchas machvas shows up to the kohen. If he has kavana for a marcheshes, maybe his kavana for the marcheshes was a valid kavana, because maybe the Bailam who identified this as a marcheshes placed it into a machvas and then submitted it. So the kohen's machshava isn't completely a write-up, and therefore his machshava should be able to invalidate the mincha, this mincha, because it's a valid kavana of shalai l'shma. It's actually a machvas, and he has kavana for a marcheshes. That is the Gemara's kasha. So the first thing you would ask me was, how cuckoo is this kohen? It's coming as a marchesh. It's coming. It's identified. It's coming as a machvas. It's sitting here in a machvas. Maybe the kohen thought that it's not really a machvas. It's really a marcheshes, and the Bailam said that I'm bringing a minchas, that this minchas is a marcheshes, and he put it into a keli of a machvas and brought it. Like, isn't that a little bit like far-fetched? Isn't that a little bit far-fetched? What's more far-fetched in your opinion? That, or just that he had the wrong kavanah? So Zok the Rashba asks this kasha. The art scroll brings down. I don't have a masifta for this masech. I have an art scroll, so art scrolls also work for me. So he brings down a very interesting Rashba. Yes, it's very far-fetched to think that the kohen thinks that the really marcheshes presented the machvas, but it's even more far-fetched than he should have a real kavanah of shalai l'shma. That a kohen should have a kavanah of shalai l'shma that's totally off the charts. That's even less likely than such a weird scenario where the kohen's machshava of shalai l'shma has some legitimacy to it. So the kohen's doing it with a good cheshbon. Zok to Gemara, you have a very good kasha, but guess what? This brisa that you quoted that says harezu psula, meaning it's not the keli that the mincha is in that determines what type of mincha it is. Rather, it's the words of the Bailam who said harezu marcheshes. the Bailam who said this is a marcheshes designates this as a minchas marcheshes, and therefore even if it was placed into a machmas, it still retains its identity as a minchas marcheshes. That's only according to the Rabbanan. So the Rabbanan Hachanami. But guess what? Our whole discussion is only for Rab Shimon over here. But Rab Shimon doesn't agree with the Rabbanan. Rab Shimon, Kivin do Amar Rab Shimon, Af Yidei Didra Yotza. You know what Rab Shimon holds? Rab Shimon says, I take a container of flour, and I say, Arezu Marcheshes, and then we're makrivit as a Michas Machvas, Yoytze. The designation doesn't even matter. You know what? Because Alma Kriusa the man of Alav Klumu. Shimon holds the label that the Baal Hamincha gives it has zero relevance. So even if he took a flour to the Rezu Marcheshes, it doesn't make it into Marcheshes. You know where it will be determined what it is? When it's brought, depending on what it's brought in. So therefore, according to Reb Shimon, this would not have been an option. It doesn't make a difference to say whatever you bring is good, because Reb Shimon really looks at all the Menachos as one category. So according to Reb Shimon, it's not going to be a problem, and therefore, if you say on a machmas to marcheshes or vice versa, that's obviously patently false, and the kavanah is not a good kavanah. Okay, so we've now gotten through that kasha, but the Gemara is hammering away. Don't forget, Rabba's teretz was offered to us in the middle of Beis Beis. We're a full amud later, and the Gemara is still in the middle of hammering away at Rabba. Until we turn over to Amud Beis, we're going to be busy with Rabba asking kasha upon kasha on his pshat. Elo meyata oila sheshachat l'shem chatos, an oila that you shacht l'shem chatos tirtze. Because that's also patently false. You know why? The high zachar, an oila, is brought from a male animal behind the keva. So if you're shechting a male animal, your kavanah l'shem chatos is patently false, because you know this cannot be a chatos, because a chatos would be a female animal. Zok to Gemara, well, kivan the ikasir nasi, it's not true. There is one example of a carbon chatos that will be brought as a male animal, which is the sir nasi. So maybe when he's shechting the oila l'shem chatos, he's shechting it l'shem chatos of a sir nasi. The zochru, that would be a male, lo yadia. So it wouldn't be a patently false kavana, and therefore it would possible. What about Omar l'shem chatos yochid ma'ikla meimar? What if his kavana was very specific? He said, I'm shechting this l'shem the chatas of a yochid, not the chatas of a nasi. So there, weiter, his machshava that he articulated is patently false, because a chatas could not be brought from a male animal. Visu, and we got another problem. What about a chatas yochid sheshachta l'shem oila? If you had a chatas yochid, which was a female animal, that you shechted l'shem oila, again, that's a patently false kavana. Therefore, Taratza, it shouldn't be a problem of Shaloi L'Shema. According to Reb Shimon, according to Rabba's interpretation of Reb Shimon, the Chatos Nekeva V'Oilo Zachar. Zok to Gemara, that's not a problem. You know why? Because if it's a sheep, the sheep's tail blocks out that area of the animal, and unless you lift the tail up and look, you might not even be able to know if it's a male or a female. So who said that it's so obvious to this person bringing the chatos that it's a female? He might not even realize that it's a female, because michse be'alya, the area that would determine the gender, would be covered over with the tail. That would be good if he brought a lamb, because a lamb has that thick tail that covers over that area. But Isi Seira, a Seira is also a female. Seira is also a female goat, is also eligible to be brought as a chatos, and a female goat, its area where you would see the gender is not concealed at all. So it's obvious that he's shechting a female animal, and he's shechting it l'shem oila. That shouldn't be a valid kavanah shalei l'shema, Michael Amemar. Ella, at the end of the day, bein zchorim and the kavos lava the toyd inchi. That's when someone's shechting a behema. That's not all he's looking for. Is it male? Is it female? He's shechting an animal. He's not focusing on that at all. So therefore, it's not a patently false kavanah. Frank Gemara, okay, you're not out of the dark yet. Pesach sheshachti l'shem Moshe. if you shechted a Pesach, which has to be 1 year old, and you shechted a Shemoshim that should be 2 years old, it's clear that you're shechting an immature young animal. Surely you know that this cannot be a good carbon for an Asham. Lirtzi, the high ben shana, the high ben shtayim. Zot Gemara, no, because you have certain Ashamois that are also ben shana. Kivandika Asham Nazir, Vasham Etzoyra, that could be a ben shana, like Paskalai. So he might think that he's shechting this Pesach l'shem Hasham Nazir or l'shem Hasham Etzoyra, where the carbon of a 1 year old would be the appropriate carbon for the Asham. What about Omar l'shum Hasham Gezelos, l'shum Hasham Elos? What if he was specific? He was shechting a carbon Pesach, and he said, "I have kavana l'sham Gezelos." There, clearly, it's supposed to be an animal that's a minimum of 2 years old, and he has an animal that's only 1 year old. Why would that be Shaloi L'Shema? V'su, what about Hasham Gzelos, V'Hasham Elos, which are older animals, Sheshachta L'Shem Pesach? That's obviously not good for a carbon Pesach. The animal's too old. Lirtzi, the Pesach ben Shana, Bahani ben Shtei Shana. Zot Gemara, who said that every coin that checks a carbon could work in an amusement park in a guess your age booth? Who said you can tell? Elabain ben Shana, ben Shtei Shadim, Lavad Atadinshi. Not a typical person cannot just look at an animal and guess its date of birth. Does the Ika ben Shana, the Michsi Keven Shtayim, there are animals that are only a year old that look like they're 2 years old, they look more mature. The Ika ben Shtayim, and you can have a 78-year-old man, the Michsi Keven Shana, who colors his hair. Ooh, did I just say that, or was I just thinking that? You could have the older animal that looks younger. Okay, Zok Gemara, we'll try something else. What about a seir sheshachta l'shem osham? Now, an osham has to be brought of a sheep. Can't be a goat. So if you have a goat, which clearly could only be an oila, and you shechted l'shem osham, that should not be a valid kavan of shaloi l'shma. Lirtzi, it should be maratza. The high temer, high seir, a sheep has wool, which is what you would use for a asham. But an oila, you can even use a goat, which doesn't have wool, it just has skin. It has skin with a little bit of fuzz on it. So that's obvious, a different type of animal. So maybe Amri Dikra Uchmahu. You know what he could have thought it was? He could have thought it was a sheep that was black, that was just shorn. So it looks like an ace because it has very short hair. Frank the Gemara, what about an Egal Upar? What is an Egal Upar good for? It's good for a par Helam Dovishal Tzibur. It's good for a par Koy Mashiach. And he shechted it Shaloi L'Shma, Sheshachta L'Shem Pesach. Now clearly, you don't use a cow or a calf for a Pesach. You use a sheep. So isn't that patently false kavana? And therefore, it should not be a valid kavana of Shaloi L'Shma. Lirtzu, the Egal Upar, the Pesach, the Osham Leka. You never use an Egal or a par. Not everybody knows the difference between a sheep and a calf. Zok ein hachanami. Checkmate. You're right, because you have an example of even a zevach that, according to Rab Shimon, would not be possible shaloi l'shma because of his svar of mincha. That it's obvious that this is a false and fake kavana. Zok Gemara umay zvachim roiv zvachim. When Rab Shimon said that mincha is unlike zvachim because mincha the machshava is patently false, but by the zvachim, the shchita is all the same, the zrika is all the same, the kabbalah is all the same. He didn't mean every single zvachim. He meant the vast majority of zvachim, the kavana wouldn't be patently false. It would be explainable and justifiable. But you're right. You could find, in very select cases, an example of where the machshav of shalom shema for zvachim would also not be valid. And now we have just concluded the Gemara's analysis of Rabba's teretz. So let's just remind ourselves what Rabba's teretz was. The Rab Shimon who says that the machshava of shaloi l'shma apostles, that's a machshava of shaloi l'shma that is shaloi l'shem bailim, which that's not obvious in an animal who it belongs to. But the machshava of mincha of shaloi l'shma, I said animal, I mean mincha, but a machshava of shaloi l'shma of a mincha where Rab Shimon says there's no such thing is someone who would be able to make a mistake, that's referring to Shinu Kodesh. He had Kavanah for Macheches or Machves or vice versa. That's a sheet of Rabbah. And we also learned that even Rabbah agrees that there are certain limited cases of Zvachim where it would also be a patently false Machshava and it wouldn't pass al Shalai Lishma. And if you remember, the Gemara said Rabbah's teretz does not help us with our Mishnah because our Mishnah, you cannot say, is speaking of a case of Shalai Lishma, of Shalai Lishem Bailim, because the Mishnah is very specific that it's talking about different Menachos. Okay, now we'll go to Rava. Rava Amar, Loi Kasha, the steer in Reb Shimon is not a Kasha. Kan b'koybet mincha l'shum mincha, kan b'koybet mincha l'shum zevach. It depends what the purpose of the kavanah was. If he had kavanah to another mincha, that will say is kosher. L'shum zevach, that going to be a machshava psula. So right away, our kasha, when we learned Rava yesterday, was it's if the svara is that my chichan, no one could possibly mistake a mincha for a carbon. So zog to Gemara, you're right, but the reasoning for Reb Shimon is not that. It's actually because of a pasuk, because the Torah has a pasuk that's makish all of the menachos to one another. It says v'zois Torah hamincha, and we dash in the pasuk Torah achas l'chol hamenachos. So therefore, no matter what kavanah, of what type of mincha you had kavanah for, the Torah is telling us a chiddush that that's not a problem when it comes to menachos. However, mincha l'shum zevach, that we don't have a pasuk for. V'zois Torah hamincha v'zevach loiksiv, that it doesn't say. It's a beautiful pshat. It's all deraises. It's all drushes. The pasuk says that by mincha there's no problem with shalol shema, and by zevach there is a problem with shalol shema. It's a beautiful pshat. There's only one problem. That's not what Reb Shimon said. Isn't that what Reb Shimon said? So how could you make up your whole pshat and try to squeeze this into Reb Shimon? Reb Shimon simply didn't say that. Zok to Gemara, and here we're going to be departing from what we have understood as a fact up until this point. We understood as a fact up until this point that a machshava that's valid, meaning it could be justified why the Kohen is having this machshava, that's a legitimate machshava of Shaloi Lishma. But a machshava that's so off the wall that it's not shayach, I'm having kavanah for marcheshes, when I'm working on a machmas, I'm clearly not making a valid machshava, that will not pass the mincha, right? That was the sheet of Rabbah. Now we're departing from that. Now we're saying fakert, a mincha that you for sure puzzle, for sure a bad kavanah, that's even worse. If it could be mistaken for the right carbon, okay, that's bad, shalom l'shma. But if you know for sure it's a machmas and you have kavanah from macheshes, that's even more damaging to the carbon. Why? Rashi says the reason for that would be because then people will think that you never need l'shma. People will think you'll never lead the Shema ever. Shema Yomer Mutar L'Shames B'Karbanos. People are going to think that you could willy-nilly change any carbon that you want.
How about pickle?
Well, pickle parcels. So, yeah, you're right. Pickle less parcels. What's the kasha that should have been asked?
You're saying that the people will think that you could.
If we're going to allow you to have a wrong kavanah, even though it's patently false on its face, and there's no way you could be thinking you're working on a machvas when you're working on macheshes, we still say that parcels, because if we didn't say that parcels, then people are not going to take seriously the identification of a carbon. But where else could you have asked such a kasha?
Yeah, but I pickle too. Never had me a pickle.
So what's your question? What should halacha be by pickle? I'm not sure what you're suggesting.
I'm just saying, like, what's the big finish? What's the finish? Saying like watching.
Even if it's a machshav is patently false, we'll still give it validity as a machshav of shaloi l'shma, because otherwise people will think that the designation of a carbon has no value. I think that's an important chiddush. So zok to Gemara, hachik amar, avagav de machshava de loy minkarahi. Now, up until now, how do we have touched machshava de loy minkarahi? It's a machshava that is a shtickle valid, right? But now Rashi tells us to read the Gemara differently. Avagav de machshava loy minkarahi. This is not a machshava that you can't tell if it's a right machshava or not. Rather, it's a machshava where it's obvious that you're completely wrong. You had kavanah for machmas instead of marcheshes, or vice versa. The tivsal, and logic should say it should be very possible, but we have Exeris Akasha to tell you otherwise. Zois Torah Samicha tells us that Torah Achas L'chol HaMenachos. Frank Gemara, what does it mean? Umay Aval B'Zvachim Eina King. What does Reb Shimon mean when he says Aval B'Zvachim Eina King? Because according to Rabbi's Pshat, it meant that by Zvachim you could make a mistake. Because how can you tell when you're shechting an animal or you're making zrika or a kabbalah? There you can't tell what type of carbon it is. But that contrast has nothing to do with it. Right now in Rava's Pshat, it's all about whether or not you have a pasuk. So what was Rabbi Shimon saying? Zog to Gemara, again, it's going to be a little bit of a kvetch. Avagav, the shchita achas l'kulam, even though there's one shchita l'kulam, and as Rashi, you can see Rashi's massaging these words. The hashchita achas l'kulam, v'ikal meimar, you might be able to argue the tala l'shem choiva, it should be a kosher carbon, because the shaloi l'shma was not so radically different than what it's supposed to be. The lekala migzar shema yoimru muter l'shamis bezvachim. There you wouldn't be geyser because it's not so boilet in the kavana that it's wrong. Afilu achi loy alu. You know why? The zoyis teres amincha v'zevach loiksiv, because that would be mashma to have a mashma Torah achas l'chol hamenachos v'Torah achas l'chol azvachim. So, but it doesn't say that, and therefore v'zoyis teres hamincha v'zevach loiksiv. So here we're saying even if it's completely false, kavana doesn't make a difference because it's not boiled so much, and there's no reason to be geyser, and we don't have the pasuk to support it. Zok to Gemara, okay. Elamayata chatos chelev teshachta l'shem chatos dam. We know that someone who dam b'shoigig and someone who chelev b'shoigig, if it's b'mezid, there's a chiyuv kares, and if it's b'shoigig, there's a chiyuv chata. There's a chiyuv chatas. So what if there are two korbanos and one got mixed up with the other one? Chatas chelas sheshach l'shem chatas dam, or l'shem chatas avodas kachavim, or l'shem chatas nazir, or l'shem chatas mitzayra. All these take shera, should be kosher v'teratze, and there should be no psul of shalosh shema there. Why? The Amar Achmana, Vizois, Torah Sachatos, Torah Achas L'chalakatais. According to you, Reb Shimon who holds that when the Torah says Zois Torah Shamincha, it's to tell you that they're all interchangeable, and if you had Kavanah for A, when you were doing B, it wouldn't be a psul. Those exact same words the Torah uses when it's describing the carbon chatais. So according to you, there should be no psul of Shaloi L'Shma by a chatos. Zok Gemara leRab Shimon hachanami. According to Rab Shimon, there's a big chiddush now in Rava. According to Rab Shimon, there's no psul shaloi l'shema by achatos. That's a huge chiddush. That's a huge chiddush. Zok Rashi. According to Rab Shimon, in fact, there's no chatos shaloi l'shema because of zois taris achatos. That's a huge chiddush. But according to Rabbanon is where you would have it. Only according to Rabbanon who argues in Reb Shimon would there be a problem of Shaloi L'Shema, because the Rabbanon aren't darshaning this Zois Teres Hamincha to say that they're all the same, and so too by Zois Teres Hachatos he won't learn that they're all the same. Zok to Gemara, Rava said, Chatas Chelev Sheshachta L'Shem Chatos Dam. L'shem chatos avodas kachavim kshera, but l'shem chatos nazir, l'shem chatos mitzayra is psula. So the problem is, we just said that according to the way Rava understood Reb Shimon, all chatois have no problem of shaloi l'shema because it says zois teres achatos, but that's not what Rava himself said. Rava himself said it's psula. Zok to Gemara. You know why it's psula? By l'shem chatos nazir and l'shem chatos mitzayra, tahani oilois b'hadayu ninu. Chatos nazir and chatos mitzayra is very different from the regular chatois, and that's where there will be a psul of shaloi l'shma. And Rashi has three pshatim of what the hanu oilos b'hadayu ninu is. One pshat is a nazir and a mitzvah don't bring one korban chatos; they bring a chatos with an oila. So we're afraid. The reason why it's possible is because we're afraid that he'll mix up the oila with the chatos, and that's why it's going to be possible. That was Rashi's first pshat. Rashi's second pshat is the chatos itself is only considered an oila, because the chatos of the mitzvah and the chatos of the nazir is not to be mechaper on the chait that you're chayiv chorus for. It's just to be machshir him to come back into the tzibur. That's not really a chatos. We look at it as an oila. We had this svara before in Zvachim. And the third pshat, which Rashi disagrees with, is that this chatos needs nesachim and most chatos don't need nesachim. So those are the three pshatim why the chatas of Nazir and the chatas of Mitzvah are very different from the chatas chaylev and the chatas dam and the chatas of Avodah Zarah, and therefore that would be psul of shaloi l'shma, and the zois teres chatas wouldn't include those. Zogt Gemara weiter. Reb Acha b'rei de Rava masni lei lekula lepsula. Reb Acha b'rei Rava holds that the b'rei de Rava held they were all by chatas. They're all going to be possible. They're all going to be possible. What about the kasha that we had on Rava? It says zois teres chatas. That's not enough by a chatos to say that there's no psul of shaloi l'shma from one to the next, because the pasuk says more than that. It says v'shachat oisa lechatos. That oisa is an extra word to tell you l'shem oisoi chatos. So there's a special pasuk by chatos, even though it says ois chatos, but the oisa says that you have to be specific with the chatos. Okay, let's see what Rashi says. Matal kulu psula afilu chatas chaylev sheshachat l'shem chatas tam. It would be psula milahakriv because it says oisa. Okay, go about it. Now we have our third teretz. So while Rabba's teretz took up an amud and a half to analyze, Rabba's teretz only took up a half amud, barely. Rav Ashi Omar, this is the Rav Ashi who he said, according to Rav Ashi, Rav Shimon will even stim with our Mishnah. Rav Ashi Omar loy kasha. Kan bekoimet machvas l'shum marcheshes. Kan bekoimet minchas machvas l'shum minchas marcheshes. And the Gemara explains, machvas l'shum marcheshes, that's not a psul of shaloi b'chavana on the mincha, because this kavana had nothing to do with the mincha. B'mona kamachashev. He said this is a machvas instead of a marcheshes. That's not the kavana of the korban. He's just thoughtfully identifying what type of keli it is in that has nothing to do with the kashrus of the korban. B'mona kamachashev, umachashev b'mona, umachshav b'mona le pasla. But if he had kavana by a minchas machvas l'shum minchas marcheshes, that already is touching the kavana of the korban. The mincha the pasla b'machshava kamachashev. He's having a false machshava shaloi l'shema machshava on the korban itself, where we know there is a psul of shaloi l'shema. Frank the Gemara, a very nice svara Rabashi, but that's still not what the words of Reb Shimon are. Isn't that the lashon? And with you, it has nothing to do with that. With you, it's a completely different thing. I wasn't talking about the mincha; I was talking about the keli. Right? It's a totally different shayla. Zok Gemara hachika amar, and we're going to be massaging these words in Rabashi very similar to the way we massaged it in Rava. And of course, it's going to be Iker Chaser in a Sefer. So Avogab, the Mechshava Min Karhi Tipasel. So right away, there's Hagah. If you look at the Yud Beis in the Shita Mekubetzes, it says, Avogab the Mechshava the Loi Min Karhi the Tipasel, even though it's a mincha, it's a machshava that's not minkara, and it should be puzzle. Zok, I'm reading inside. So he's sticking in all these extra words, even though it's a machshava that's a minkar, but it's not going to be puzzle because he only had the machshava on the mana. So that's what it is. Even if it's Maiseh Mechichala, it still won't puzzle because his kavanah is on the keli, not on the mincha. Strike the Gemara. Umay aval b'zvachim einakein. By zvachim, it's actually exactly the same. Because by mincha, it's a completely different reason. He didn't have kavanah on the korban; he had kavanah on the keli. Zok Gemara, I'll tell you what it means. Af agav the shchita achas lekulan, kabbalah achas lekulan. Zriga achas lechulon, bizvicha the postle bei machshava kamachashev. By zvicha, you know why it passes? Because he's thinking about zvicha. Zvicha shalom lishma will passel, but just thinking about the wrong keli wouldn't passel. Gewaltig. Amalei Rabacha Barei de Rav Ravashi. So now Rabacha Barei de Rav is going to challenge Rabashi's pshat. So based on what you're saying, that if you have kavanah on the keli, it's nothing. Only if you have kavanah on the mincha. Well, what if you were dealing with a mincha that doesn't have a keli? Chareva mishum belula. A chareva is a mincha that's dry. It doesn't need a keli to be mishtin. And you add kavanah that it should be one of the minchas belula is b'shemen. There, clearly, it's not the right kavanah. It's not the right carbon, because there the type of keli, or whether it's the keli or not, impacts what type of mincha it is. Amai, what are you going to say to that? Why is that not going to be possible? Amar Shimon, Amar lei l'shum bila ba'alma. Amai, what would Reb Shimon say? Amar lei l'shum bila ba'alma. You know what he meant when he said by mishum, when he had kavod al belula, when he said chareva, he didn't even mean talking about a mincha belula. He was just saying it's a mixer. So to Rashi, kiven lo itkar behedja minchas chareva l'shem mincha belula, because that's the only time where Rabashi holds it would be a problem. Divrei ruach ba'almaninu. You don't even say he's referring to what type of mincha it is when he says belula. I'm doing it because I like Mr. Bila. But it's not an expression of identification of the mincha itself. In fact, once you're going to say that it could still be speaking shtusim, even though the words seem to mean a type of mincha, well, the yachi l'shem shalomim nami l'shem shalomim ba'alma. Maybe the guy shechs on oil l'shem shalomim, that shouldn't be shalom l'shma. He didn't mean shalomim the carbon. He meant I'm making peace with Hashem. I'm giving him a gift. Once you're willing to discount the word that a guy is saying, Zok Gemara, there's a very big difference. Hachiyasha. Hasam zavach gufa ikri shlamim. The Torah directly refers to the carbon as a carbon shlamim. Dichsiv ha'makar is dam ha'shlamim. Hazorik is dam ha'shlamim. But hacha mincha gufa mi ikri belula. You'll never find that the mincha is called belula. Look at the pasuk. It says b'chol mincha belula b'shemen ksiv. Belula b'shemen ikri belula stamalo ikri belula. So if he just says l'shem belula, it doesn't mean anything. If he said l'shem belula b'shemen, maybe you'd have a problem. Okay, now Karabaloy Amri, Rab Ashi and Rava disagreed with Rabba's pshat, right? That's why they each had their own pshat. Why? Because the Adarabba Michshava the Minkara Pasal Rachmana. They disagreed with Rabba's whole premise that a Machshava that's patently false, that's not better, that's worse. Why didn't they like Rava's pshat? Because they hold v'zoyis toiras loy mashmalu. His whole pshat was, it says v'zoyis toiras by mincha to say they're all the same. They disagree. You see, by chatas you don't do that. And Rav Ashi lo yamri, why didn't they like Rav Ashi's pshat? That it depends on if he said the mincha or just the keli. Mishum kusha de Ravacha berei de Rava, because of Ravacha's kasha, and that is, what about a mincha of hareva that he said is blula? And they didn't like his pshat that it means to say bila ba'alma. They thought that it should mean the mincha. Zok Gemara, milsa the pshita le Rabba lahagisa, ula Rava lahagisa, a halacha that Rabba knows for sure what halacha is. That means a machshava she'ena gluya pasla lo v'loy hagluya, right? Rabba shita was, if it's patently false, it wouldn't passel. So it's clear to Rava that if a machshava is patently false, it would not passel. Ula Rava lahagisa, and Rava also, if it was patently false, it would passel. Mi boy le Rav Hoshia. Rav Hoshia was mesupik about that exact point. The boy Rav Hoshia of Amr le boy minei Rav Hoshia berabashi. Mincha l'shum zevach. What if you shot the mincha l'shum zevach? That's patently false. Mali Amr Rab Shimon. What did Rab Shimon say? Do you say Tamid Rab Shimon mishum the machshava the mincha loy pasla va machshava the mincha, which is according to Rabbi it wouldn't passel. I deal with Tamid Rab Shimon mishum the chsiv v'zoy story mincha, which is Rashi's shot. It says like siv, and therefore, according to Rava, it would be possible. Amar le Rav Asi told Rav Hoshia, "You think they're both right? You think one of the two are right? Maybe they're both wrong." Who said any one of your three pshatim and Rav Shimon are right? They might all be wrong. Why? Because of Abaye's kasha, what was Abaye's kasha on Rabbah? He said he brought rise that other karbonos, if it's patently false, it will still be a psul of shaloi l'shema. Kirabaloi mishani lei mishum kushya Abaye, because the Abaye's kasha. Kirabaloi mishani lei mishum kushya of azoyis teres achatos. The same lotion that it says by Michet says by Chatos. And Karavachi lo Mishanle, why didn't he like Rabashi's teretz? Mishum Kushya de Ravacha de Rava, which is Bila, which is a Michet Charevi that they call it Mechablula. So it could be all the three pshatim that we just learned to forever the steer Reb Shimon are wrong, and therefore you can't even speculate what Reb Shimon would hold by a machshava that's patently false on its face. Okay, we'll stop here. There goes our whole lead. I thought we were going to be a little bit ahead. Now we're not ahead anymore. But at least we had the time to understand the sugyas.